Hi friends, Rick Edwards here. Thank you for joining me for another session from the Gospel Project. Today we're going to be looking at the core passage found in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 6 through 15, and then jumping over to verses 18 through 20. Now this chapter 17 of 2 Kings is really one of the more significant passages in all of the Old Testament because it details for us in pretty good detail the collapse and fall and the conquering of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, by Assyria. Very significant event. This event takes place in 722 BC. And just so you know, we have some other contextual videos that might help you as you approach this or any of the lessons in 1st and 2nd Kings. We have a video on, that's an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings. We have a video on a basic timeline of 1st and 2nd Kings. And then we have a video that just provides some insights about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings as a whole. So let's just jump right into this text in 2 Kings 17. Now, I want to point out and make certain we understand this text in the light of the book's purpose. And we talk about this in the overview video. But the purpose of these two books collectively, 1st and 2nd Kings, and remember we've said this before, originally the books of 1st and 2nd Kings were just one book. So they were divided later due to length, but they're just intended to be one book and read as one book. So you read straight from 1st Kings into 2nd Kings. The author brought all this together, intended for these two books to really be read as one book. So what was the book's purpose? Well, if you go back and look at the overview of 1st and 2nd Kings, we'll be talking more depth about this. The basic purpose of the book, or these books, was to demonstrate how the human monarchy had failed. Even though David was this great king that everybody looked to and all the other kings were compared to, the book starts off with David being debilitated and old. He was not going to live forever. The book ends with the final Davidic king living in Babylon, and while he's gaining favor with Babylon and the Babylonian king, he's still, for all practical purposes, a powerless king living in exile. And then you've got all these kings in between that demonstrate just how bad the human monarchy was. And remember now, we've got two different kingdoms. Israel, the 10 northern kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel in the north, they had 20 kings and none of them did well. Judah in the south, the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, also had 20 kings, just coincidental, also had 20 kings, and only 8 of their kings did very well. So Judah wasn't much better than Israel, but they did do a little better and managed to survive a little bit longer. So the point of the books, this 1st and 2nd Kings, is to demonstrate that the human monarchy simply wasn't adequate to do what God wanted it to do. Okay, and we talk about that again in the overview video, so you might want to check that out. Now, moving on, the monarchy in Israel, and again we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. The monarchy in Israel had failed, and I want to point this out in verse 8, and by the way, I'm quoting from the lesson, from the text in the student guide, the personal study guide. In chapter 8, the second part of chapter 8, let me just read the whole verse. It says they lived, talking about the Israelites, the northern kingdom, they lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. So the point here is that the kings of Israel, this monarchy, had led the people astray. Now they carried their own level of responsibility, but the fact is the text makes it obvious that part of the problem in Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, part of the problem is that they were following these kings that led them astray. So keep that in mind. The monarchy had failed in Israel, and by the way, it was also going to fail in Judah. Just give it a little more time, okay? Now, I want to point out some things that are going to be important for you to understand, I believe. First of all, you need to understand the difference between deportation versus dispersion. Now, the text says in verse 6 that in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, he, the king of Assyria, deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halah. And then he goes on to talk about where they were taken, including the cities of the Medes. That's all in verse 6 of chapter 17. So on the one hand, they are taken from their land. The Israelites living in the northern kingdom, these 10 northern tribes, are taken by the Assyrians and they are taken to other places. In that sense, they were deported. So when it says he deported the Israelites, that's an accurate term. He did deport them. But it wasn't just a deportation. He also dispersed them. So we don't know exactly how this was done, but the people were deported and dispersed. And you need to understand the difference. They were taken to other places, but they were not taken as a single group to one place, which is, by the way, what happened to the people of Judah. When Babylon conquered them, they were deported as a group and taken to a single place in Babylon. So they were deported, but not dispersed. The Israelites were deported and dispersed. And that's going to become important to us in just a moment. So, and it tells us there again in verse 6 that they settled them in Halah along the Habor, the Gozans River, and in the cities of the Medes. So they were dispersed into multiple places. And they did this for a reason that we're going to come back to in just a moment. Now, I want to point out this interesting word in verse 9, where it says, the Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. What does that mean? That they did these things secretly, as if God couldn't see them? Well, that's not the author's point. He's not saying that the Israelites were somehow doing things that God could not see. Of course, the writer would never suggest that. They understood that God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, and we understand that God is an omniscient God. He sees everything. Nothing happens in secret to God. But what this means is the fact that they did certain things secretly means that they were outwardly observing the ritual of the Hebrews, the Old Testament covenant traditions. They appeared to be faithful to the law. They appeared to be faithful to the religious practices and the behavior that they were supposed to have. They looked good on the outside in their religious practice, but secretly in their heart, they were doing things, it says, that were against the Lord their God. Now, that's very, very important to understand that there was this discrepancy between their outward religion and their inward heart or hearts. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go along. Now, this dispersion that's taking place, remember, they were deported and dispersed. Sorry. Well, once they get there to these various cities, we don't know the extent to which they were dispersed. We don't know if they were dispersed in some cases, this person here, that person there, this family here, that family there, or if they were allowed to settle in groups. But if they were allowed to settle in groups, they probably weren't very big groups, because their dispersion, the fact that they were taken to these many different places, led to assimilation. Now, this was the point. The king of Assyria, when he would conquer people, and this was their practice, when they would conquer people, they would take them and disperse them, because this dispersion led to assimilation. You didn't want the people you had conquered to maintain their national identity or their cultural identity or their religious identity. You wanted them to essentially forget who they were and become just one of everybody else, one of us. We've conquered them. We want them to become one of us. And that's what happened as a result of this dispersion. So these Israelites, the 10 northern tribes, the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, were dispersed, and then that dispersion led to assimilation. So they lose their identity. They forget who they are. Given a generation or two, pretty soon they're just settled in. They become one of everybody else. Dispersion led to assimilation. Very important to understand. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. Assimilation, which is when you lose your identity, you forget who you have been and you take on the identity of the culture around you, assimilation is easy when you are no different than those people. Keep this in mind. What had happened was, in Israel, these people culturally and religiously had become just like everybody else. So now when they get deported and dispersed to these other lands, to these other places, it's not difficult to become assimilated because you're already there. You're just like them anyway. You're already just like your neighbors. So there's nothing different about you. There is no true identity to be lost. So it's easy to be assimilated when you are no different than the people among whom you are now living. For example, listen to this. Chapter 17, verse 8a, the first part of verse 8. They lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before them. What's that saying? They had just become like everybody else. They were just like the people they had displaced living in Israel. So they were no different. Look at verse 11, the second part of verse 11. They were just like the nations that the Lord had driven out. They were just like the nations that the Lord had driven out. There was no difference between them. Now, this is before the deportation. This is before the dispersion. They were no different than everybody else. And then verse 15, the second part of verse 15, it says they were following the surrounding nations the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. So folks, this is important. Understand, they had become just like everybody else. So when Assyria conquers them, deports them, and disperses them among all these other nations, it was easy for them to be assimilated into these other lands, these other cities, these other cultures, these other people. It was easy for them to be assimilated because they were already like them. There was no difference between the Israelites living in Israel and now the Israelites living in these other places. So assimilation is easy when you are no different. And then we looked at these verses. So here's what I want to conclude and what I want to suggest is that our spiritual identity must be, and I'm talking about us today, our spiritual identity, who we are as God's people, who we are as Christians today, our spiritual identity must be deeper than our outward religious practices. If all we're doing, if all you and I ever do is just go to church, go through the motions, raise our hands, sing the songs, do the things, serve on the committees, if all we ever do is just go through the outward religious practices of being a good church member, a good Christian, if that's all we ever do, that's not enough. We will simply be practicing secretly. We will be one thing on the outside, but in our hearts, secretly, we will be something else. And that I think is the primary lesson of this chapter 17, to understand that we don't want to be simply Christian on the outside. We want to be Christian on the inside as well. We don't want to be secretly something different than what we're professing on the outside. Well, thanks for listening. I hope that's been helpful. We'll see you next time.